Hello, everybody. Welcome to Medicine and Science on the Pod TV network. I'm Nick Pellavita. I will be a moderator for today's show. And today's show, we're going to look at medicine and politics, as politics has now invaded the medical sciences. So the real question is, what extent is our politics basically damaging your health? In other words, it's been co-opted by politics as opposed to science. With that, we will not be talking to Dr. Donald Trump because last time I looked, he did not receive a medical degree. And I will not be talking to RFK. I didn't invite him on a medicine show because I looked at his degree. His is like mine. He's a lawyer. He is not a doctor. Now, some people made the argument, well, they can still speak on behalf of medicine. No, that's very interesting. It's like me talking like I know a lot about medicine. It's frankly not true. But we do have somebody who is actually a real medical doctor. Those are the people I like to talk to. Actually went to medical school and actually is board certified in internal medicine. And usually when I have a health problem, I go to a medical doctor. I do not go to my lawyer. I do not go to my friendly politician for medical advice. So with that, we're going to bring in a real doctor, Dr. Michael Patmos, who can probably give us some better ideas what's happening in the medicine field as more and more people are looking to take their medical advice from environmental attorneys and politicians as opposed to medical doctors. Although I have now seen the medical profession raise up and tell people how things really are. So what are your thoughts about this, medicine and politics?
Well, good morning, Nick. I think this is a very big issue. And if you look back over the years, it's become increasingly common for politicians for people to politicize medical topics. If you think about, COVID was heavily politicized. The vaccines have been heavily politicized. Abortion is heavily politicized. And going back further, there were other things that were heavily politicized. Even the creation of Medicare and Medicaid was heavily politicized. So I think we're seeing more and more of it. And it's really a dangerous thing because physicians are expected, as a matter of our ethical training and our ethical foundation, to treat all people as equal. We don't pick and choose who we treat based upon politics or religion or gender or any race or anything else. That's well stated in the Hippocratic Oath, which refers to the principle that whatsoever house I enter, I go for the benefit of the patient. So what that means, what Hippocrates meant by that, whatsoever house I enter, it doesn't matter who we take care of. We take care of everybody, and we don't pick and choose. And so when you have politicians entering the medical arena, creating these, artificial divides and politicizing something like vaccination, it just creates conflict and confusion, and it pits one group of people against another. And that's really a terrible thing. And we're seeing it now to degrees that I don't recall ever seeing medicine being politicized as much as it is today. Let me give you a very current example of something that's happening right now, where the politicization of such topics results in violence. As you may know, about a month ago, the CDC headquarters in Atlanta, Georgia, was shot up by an enraged young gunman who fired some 500 rounds at the CDC building, shattering windows and driving CDC workers to hide under their desks, terrifying them. Many of these CDC workers have children, and they have a daycare center there, and they were fearful for where their children were. Was the daycare center shot up? It was a terrible thing. A Atlanta police officer responded to that shooting and was killed before ultimately the shooter was himself also killed. But it was a really shocking event. And shortly afterward, Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut wrote a letter to Secretary of Health Robert Kennedy demanding that an ACIP member, Dr. Robert Malone, be removed from the committee because he had posted violent memes and violent content before and after the shooting. And Blumenthal suggested that these violent memes may be inspiring, may have been inspiring. In other words, they are what's called stochastic terrorism, where a person of some influence posts hateful content and then incites someone else to commit violence, and then steps back and says, well, it wasn't my fault. I didn't do anything. I just said something. So anyhow, Blumenthal wrote this letter that got picked up in the media and really has gotten a lot of attention. So much so that other entities are now investigating this. The Kaiser Family Foundation, CBS News, and the New York Times are currently investigating this connection between Robert Malone and what happened at CDC. And it has been amplified even further with the observation that at the recent ACIP meeting just a couple of weeks ago, CDC staffers did not attend in person. They always attend these meetings in person. They present data, they contribute, participate in the discussion, and so forth. Not the last CDC ACIP meeting. Those staffers were afraid to be in the room. And so they viewed the proceedings from a remote location, undisclosed remote location, via live stream. Now, that was breathtaking if you think about it. We have CDC staffers. These are highly skilled, highly trained, highly educated public employees who are afraid to be in the same room with ACIP members for fear for their personal safety. And as has been suggested by Dr. Malone himself, he is suspected to be the person that is scaring CDC staff. So he posted on his Substack yesterday a really bizarre rant where he talked about this. And I'll be writing a little bit about this later today on my Substack. But essentially what Dr. Malone said yesterday was that he was contacted by CBS News and Kaiser Family Foundation about stuff that he says, and he went on a rant basically saying that he is not responsible. He does not say or do anything that could possibly be interpreted as threatening to CDC. And he goes on in his Substack to threaten and attack CDC and say all sorts of horrible things about CDC and its existence and how it operates. And he specifically went into great detail about the CDC Foundation, which he claims funds an organization called Shots Heard Around the World. Shots Heard Around the World is a information source that is a sort of a rapid response to misinformation and disinformation. And so when there's misinformation about a vaccine, Shots Heard Around the World will counter that with credible information and identify where misinformation is coming from, who's saying it, and what's wrong with it. Well, Malone in his Substack yesterday made this crazy linkage where he basically said that CDC, which has a foundation which he claims funds Shots Heard Around the World, and Shots Heard Around the World puts out credible information about vaccines, that somehow this is targeting him for violence against him. And he drew an analogy between himself and Charlie Kirk, saying that this kind of information from Shots Heard Around the World, I guess he doesn't realize that shots could mean vaccines. He tries to make it sound like they're referring to gunshots, but he says that this puts him at risk of harm, just like Charlie Kirk from radical leftists. So here's a really great example of how the politics has just drilled down into our understanding of infectious diseases and epidemics and vaccines and so forth. We now have a figure on the CDC who lacks the appropriate qualifications, who says things that are highly inflammatory and posts violent memes with guns, and attacks CDC and CDC workers by name and CDC scientists by name on his Substack, where he has hundreds of thousands of followers. And then someone attacks CDC, and he says he has nothing to do with it. He denies any connection at all, but yet blames Shots Heard Around the World, provides credible vaccine information as cyber stalking him and putting him at risk of violence. It was a really bizarre rant that was hard to find the coherence in the writing. I thought it was a really good example of almost an incoherent kind of a delusional rant. So I think this is the best example I could think of where this has become politicized right now, is really around the whole vaccine thing. Donald Trump has politicized healthcare and politicized medicine more than any president that I can remember. And I can remember back all the way to Dwight Eisenhower. But I don't think any president has politicized a medical issue in the way Trump has. And he clearly did so in his first term when COVID struck, and he didn't like the recommendations he got from the infectious disease community. So he threw them all overboard and brought in pseudo experts like Malone and Dr. Bhattacharya and others to give him something that he wanted, which was the Great Barrington Declaration. Basically, let her rip, just vaccinate the old people. Don't worry about the young people. They're not in a high risk group, and just it'll all go away. So it was over. And he aligned with the anti-vax movement strongly, and supported the anti-vax movement, who supported Trump. He's tried to dance a fine line there, because he is responsible for Operation Warp Speed, which brought the vaccine into fruition much quicker than usual. And in fact, the congressional committee, the COVID congressional committee led by Republicans, lauded Operation Warp Speed and said it undoubtedly saved millions of lives. So Trump is kind of trying to have it both ways, take credit for the vaccine, but then align with the anti-vax movement. So it's all become so distorted now, because the MAGA world they are anti-vax, and anti-vax is MAGA, MAGA is anti-vax. And so Trump really now can't distance himself from the anti-vax movement. Kennedy, his Secretary of Health and Human Services, clearly anti-vax, and he has appointed all these anti-vax people to various powerful positions, including the entire ACIP now, which is comprised of unqualified anti-vaxxers, at least one of whom posts violent memes and then wonders why Senator Blumenthal complained about him. He also says that no CDC staffer, to his knowledge, has filed a complaint. Well, you can't blame them, since Malone is known to threaten and attack people who file complaints against him. So I think that just because he is unaware of CDC staff having filed complaints, doesn't mean that it's not. The CD staff is not afraid of him. I think it as he has himself suggested, he's being looked at as the source of the fear that CDC workers are sensing, and why they don't want to be in the same room with the ACIP members is because they fear for their safety. I think this is a big story. I think it's an example of politicization of healthcare gone far too deep and gone awry. And we're ripping the country in two over something like vaccination. It's just unthinkable.
Yeah, Rick.
So the government shut down today. And government policy saves lives, and government policy kills people. So before Trump, about 2.8 million Americans died every year, because that's about 1% of the population, and people, last 80, 90 years. So it makes sense that you lose 1% of Americans every year. But if you look at the mortality curve since Trump, the number of deaths has been going up 1.5% a year since Trump first got elected in 2017, not including 1.4 million COVID deaths. And some of this is because the boomers are moving into, closer to the scythe. But part of it is government policies. And this shutdown, one way or another, will increase mortality.
Mhm.
Yes. CDC, for example, has already been gutted, lost a lot of positions, and their activities have been gutted. But as a result of the shutdown, CDC is going to have to send home, I read yesterday, about a third of its what remaining staff they have. About a third of them are now not going to be going to work today because they're not going to get paid. So the CDC has one arm tied behind its back. But that's not all. There are lots of hospitals and other health agencies and health facilities that depend on government funding. So this is a government shutdown really does impact Americans and their health and safety in a very real, concrete way every day.
Yeah, well, let's also talk about the Medicaid, because in the state of North Carolina, they finally accepted Medicaid. For years, they were resisting because they didn't want to spend government funds. But now it looks to me that Medicaid is going to get pulled from a lot of individuals. And one commentator on LinkedIn, and I read a lot of the comments on LinkedIn, and we broadcast on LinkedIn or on LinkedIn Live.
I'm glad you do.
One of the doctors comment, because some people were saying, well, it should be pulled because they need to go to work. And the doctor said, well, how do we send a 3-year-old to work?
Right.
In other words, they made some very interesting observations that a lot of the people that are on Medicaid are people that, frankly, they can't work. They're disabled. And how do we tell our 3-year-olds that they need to go to work to support their medical conditions, Dr. Tatman?
Nick, I still practice. It'll be 45 years in May that I've been in the trenches taking care of people. And when I had a private practice, I did accept Medicaid. It doesn't pay very well, but I felt it was my ethical duty to accept Medicaid patients. And subsequently, I've worked in many inner city and rural areas that are considered underserved, where safety net hospitals I've worked in safety net hospitals, and I get a deep sense of gratification in working in those settings because I know those are people who have difficulty with access. Medicaid provides access to elderly, disabled, children, and those who have no access to health insurance, often because they're not employed, or they're employed, but they don't get health coverage. They don't make enough money to afford health coverage. So this is a safety net program. And there have been critics who say, oh, it's just too expensive. It's one of the biggest line items on the budget. Let's just get rid of it. But they're not thinking things through. If you have a person who is on Medicaid, let's say you have, I think of my own experience, a typical Medicaid patient I would have taken care of is a disabled patient with diabetes who's in a wheelchair and chronically ill. You take away health care from that patient, and what happens to them? They will, in short order, in a matter of days or weeks, decompensate because they're not getting ongoing medical care, and they end up in the emergency room. The emergency rooms can't refuse to see them. That's the law. They have to be seen. If you walk into an emergency room, the emergency room must evaluate you. And then if they're sick, they have to get admitted. They can't boot you out if you're sick. So by pulling Medicaid, we take sick people, deny them their care. They end up worse. They end up in the emergency room. They end up hospitalized, where the care costs far more than if they just would have had access in the first place. So cutting Medicaid doesn't save money. It costs money. It just passes on the cost to the taxpayers in another way. It makes no sense. Everybody needs quality primary care to stay healthy as possible.
So if you look at the mortality statistics, policies like pulling Medicare cost about 200,000 American lives a year. And it's expensive. End of life care is if you think about it, is the most expensive care you can get. You're in the hospital, they're trying everything. It costs a lot to die. And we're on the verge of a boost to life with the GLP-1 drugs. You talk about people with diabetes. I don't know what percent of Americans have diabetes or pre-diabetes. It's got to be, I don't know, 20%, 30% of Americans. If you can get them on the GLP-1 drugs, which are relatively cheap, you can turn millions of Americans from disabled into not disabled if they have access to adequate medical care.
Yes, you're right about that. I have one patient who has lost a third of her body weight as a result of being on tirzepatide. This is a patient who was pre-diabetic, who had other medical issues, and was very, very inconvenienced by her weight, who has lost over 100 pounds on this medication. So I've seen firsthand how well this medication can work. Yes, there are some concerns. You have to always be, all medications have risks, but you're absolutely right. Providing healthcare saves money, and taking away healthcare costs money. And so what the Republicans and Trump are doing is by taking away, scaling back healthcare, they push the cost onto others. They put vulnerable people in worse situations. And some have even suggested this is a form of eugenics. Just get rid of all these chronically ill, sick, older people, deny them healthcare, let them all die off. It's just some kind of a eugenics notion. I don't know if they're that evil. Maybe they are.
Well, if you go on Twitter, there's some people are that evil. Well, Twitter people are loudmouths, and they type stuff that they wouldn't say, or even that they actually believe. But yeah, there are a lot of people who at least say they are that cruel.
Yeah, it's just unfortunate. So all I can tell you is that as a physician, I know that when you take away Medicaid for vulnerable, chronically ill people, they will be in the hospital shortly. And because I've cared for them, I've taken care of those very patients, and that costs more money in the long run. It's way cheaper. It's a way better investment to take care of people in the office and keep them healthy, keep those diabetics under control, and rather than denying them their insulin and medications and follow. I do telemedicine now, and I hear from diabetics all the time who are out of their medication, out of their insulin, and they've lost their coverage. And what do? Where do they go? Their blood sugars, they check their blood sugars are 400, 500, 600. They have to go to the emergency room where they will get admitted.
There are other costs to the life of the nation. When you have a disabled person in the family, then the whole family struggles to take care of them, or if they can, to pay for their care. And it's also the mental life of the nation. When you have tens of millions of people who are disabled, metabolic syndrome, diabetes, the whole thing affects your thinking. And so you've got tens of millions of people whose thinking is impaired by their medical conditions, which makes the whole country kind of dumber.
Yes. And it also strikes me as just unfathomable that this is, the United States, supposedly this great nation, doesn't provide health care to all of its citizens and residents. If you go to other countries, they do. I recently had the chance to travel to Belize in Central America, not exactly a major economic powerhouse. I mean, it's a developing country in many ways, doesn't even have roads in many areas. It's really a basic new country. They provide healthcare to all their citizens, and they actually have healthcare that's available for tourists and residents and non-residents. That's actually affordable. Places like Costa Rica and Belize provide health care. European countries, they all provide health care. How is it that the United States can't figure out how to provide health care to everybody?
I don't think they travel. As you know, I have a residence in Spain, and yesterday I was looking, I may have had to go to a doctor if I had the flu. And there's always this talk, because we have universal health care here in Spain, though you can't get a doctor. Yeah, you can. As a matter of fact, I could have got one early this morning if I wanted to. The healthcare system is very accessible in Spain. It's one of the top 10 in Spain. It's universal healthcare, so we don't have people that are suffering like they do in the United States. It is a first world country. I hate to say that, U.S. You look like a third world country.
I just looked up life expectancy by country.
Yeah, what's life expectancy in Spain?
So there are about 200 countries in the world.
Right.
The U.S. is 55th in life expectancy. So we're not even in the top quarter of countries.
Right, right. And see, that's not good. And I think what the problem is that the Americans don't realize, because they don't really travel a lot, they don't live outside the country, although 5.5 million Americans like myself do. They don't realize how bad your country is. They really just don't know. They're ignorant what they're ignorant of. And they don't realize how bad the healthcare system is over there because they don't have universal healthcare like they do in the European Union.
If you look at some of the countries who beat us, it's what Dr. Patmos is talking about. Costa Rica beats us. Chile beats us. Slovenia. Puerto Rico, even though it's part of the U.S., it's listed separate, beats us. Puerto Rico. I mean, when we think of Puerto Rico, we think it's a wrecked island from getting hit with all these hurricanes and stuff. They beat us by 2 years. Their life expectancy is 81.7 years.
Yeah. Well, and in addition, you also do have that fast food epidemic, where in Spain you do not. In other words, basically, there's McDonald's and there's one Burger King I can find in a city of 200,000, but everything else is fresh vegetables, fresh fruit everywhere. I mean, that's just the name of the game. And then fresh seafood. That's what you eat here. Sorry. So you better not be into the fast food market space because they just don't.
Spain is number 10 in the world. Where you live has a life expectancy 4 years longer than America's.
Yeah.
That's a lot of time.
Yeah, and that makes a big difference.
And let's not forget the impact of shootings and gun violence in the United States. It's now one of the leading, I think it is the leading cause of death in children now, is being shot to death at a school shooting. I mean, we had, I think, 3 mass shootings over the past weekend in the United States. It's the only country in the world where you have mass shootings on a daily basis. It seems like almost every single day. I think there have been more mass shootings this year than there have been days in the year. It's really, and that contributes to our health burden as well. And it makes the country unsafe. And it's one of the reasons why the United States is not, by any measure, the best country in the world.
Oh, yeah, definitely not. If you look at it, okay, also, I checked that statistic. It's 5.62 approximately per 100,000 deaths by gun violence in the United States. In Spain, it's not 5.6, it's 0.061. I mean, the thing is, this is very strange, but the people feel safe just walking around. I feel safe walking around because nobody has guns. And I feel safe walking around at night because the place is all lit up and nobody has guns. It's just not a violent culture.
As long as
in the United States, it's like Wild Wild West. So my question is, if you have means, why would you live there? But go on.
All right. So despair kills people. Farmers in the U.S. have a suicide rate 3 times that of the rest of the population. Opioids kill more than 100,000 people, Americans, every year. Yeah. We haven't fixed that at all.
Yeah, but what we're going to do is we're going to fix the end of our show, but we want to thank Dr. Michael Patmos, who's board certified in internal medicine, and enlightening us of what's going on in medicine and politics, because it affects everybody in the United States. And of course, people are interested around the world. And we'll see you next week on Medicine and Science on the Pod TV network. In the meantime, stay healthy and talk to your doctor, not your politician, about your health. Take care.
Thank you.